Hello there and welcome to my guide for painting Warhammer 40,000's boss Snikrot, who is part of the Orcs. As you can see, the very first thing I've done is sprayed him with some matte black spray from Colourforge. To begin with, I'm going to be using a dry brush of Corvus Black to basically dry brush any areas that will remain black. This will be followed by a second dry brush. This time I'm using Eshin Grey, and it's a little bit lighter than the first dry brush. Then one more dry brush, this time using Mechanicus Standard Grey, and this is the lightest dry brush as we're only really trying to get the finer edges and sharpest points. From there, I'm going to be painting his skin with some Orruk Flesh. This will take a couple of coats as we are painting onto a dark surface, but just have some faith and take your time and you'll be getting a nice smooth coat. Then we're going to use some coelia Greenshade to ruin that nice smooth coat and to add some shading. Once our wash is dried, we're going to relayer the Orruk Flesh, taking care to avoid any of the recesses, as we want all that muscle structure to shine through. I'm then going to highlight that skin using a 50-50 mix of Orruk Flesh and wraithbone. I'm also aiming to highlight just the areas where the light would catch the most. Then finally, we're going to use that same mix, but this time it's going to be at a 70-30 ratio in favor of wraithbone, and we're going to be painting the more sharper details such as knuckles, noses, and sort of the very edges of the muscles. Next, any silver details we painted with some leadbelcher. Any brown areas such as straps or belts will be painted with some catachan flesh. The smoke grenade on his base and the one on his chest will then be painted with some mephiston red. And then finally, any white areas, basically the glyph and the smoke, will be painted with some Corax White. From there, everything that's been painted since the leadbelcher will be washed with some Nuln Oil. So that's the leadbelcher, the red, the white, and the brown. Once our wash is dried, we're going to use a 50-50 mix of leadbelcher and Stormhost silver to start highlighting all of that silver. This is mostly an edge highlight just to try and pick out the finer details. Then moving on to the belts, we're going to use a 50-50 mix of catachan flesh and Questor flesh to give an edge highlight to all that. But this time we'll follow up by a second edge highlight, but this time using Questor flesh just by itself. Then we'll relayer the mephiston red with some mephiston red, taking care to avoid any of the recesses. And that'll be given a highlight with a 50-50 mix of mephiston red and Wild Rider red. Then moving on to the white, we're going to relayer that using Corax White just by itself. We're going to make sure we avoid any of the recesses, and again, take your time with this paint as it can be a little bit tricky to use, and the key to basically painting white is just patience. And we'll then give it a highlight using a 50-50 mix of Corax White and matte white, as I don't want the white to be too overpowering. There's a few gold details on his weapons and his shoes and his sheath for his other dagger that he's got, and for that we're going to be using some Retributor Armour. I'll then use Screamer Pink to paint his tongue and the hilts, or handles I should say, of his weapons. I'm then going to paint any bones, which are basically the skulls and the bone on the top of his spare dagger, and his teeth with some wraithbone. Then the gold, the Screamer Pink, and the wraithbone will all receive a wash with some Agrax Earthshade. While that wash dries, I'm going to start painting the lights on his goggles. I'll start with a couple of bits of red. For that, I'll just use some mephiston red, which I'll highlight with a little dot of Wild Rider red. The vast majority of these will be blue, so for that I'm going to be using some Macragge Blue. This will be followed by a 50-50 mix of Macragge Blue and Calgar Blue. This will be followed by Calgar Blue just by itself. Then finally a 50-50 mix of Calgar Blue and Matte White. There's one light left, and I'm just going to paint that with a tiny bit of Caliban Green, which I'll highlight using a 50-50 mix of Caliban Green and Matte White. Once the wash on everything else is dried, I'm going to go back to the Retributor Armour and use a 50-50 mix of Retributor Armour and Stormhost Silver. This will then be followed by that same mix, but at a 70-30 ratio in favour of Stormhost Silver. His teeth and any bone will then get relayered with some wraithbone. Make sure you avoid any of the recesses. And then these will be highlighted with a 50-50 mix of wraithbone and matte white. What's left now is the basing. So for my guys, he's going to have Astro Granite, as that'll match the rest of my Orc army. But you can base yours however you like. Once the Astro Granite is dried, I'm just going to give it a simple dry brush using a small bit of grey cere. I'm then going to tidy everything up by painting the rims with a little bit of a patent black. Then finally, for a tiny bit of added flair, and this is something you can completely avoid or don't have to do if you wish, I'm going to use a little bit of weathering powder just to muddy up his shoes ever so slightly. And there we are. That's Boss Snikrot finished. I've got to say, I had an absolute blast painting this guy. He's such a joy to paint. He's a lovely, gorgeous model. He is also incredibly fast to paint as well. He only came in roughly 3 hours from start to finish. That's excluding, obviously, washes to dry. If you follow this guide, I really do hope you found it useful, and we really appreciate if you gave the channel a subscribe, the video a like, and a share to your fellow Orc players, or anyone you know who haven't got around to painting their boss Snikrot yet. As I try to keep these guides to be sort of super simple and super fast, so anyone can paint to a reasonably decent standard. I've also got guides for plenty of other different game systems on the channel as well, so if you fancy having a stoop, feel free and check some of those out. It'd be much appreciated. Thank you again for watching. Again, really do hope you found it useful, and I will see you in the next one.